Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we can just get started slowly. I mean, that's fine by us, I suppose.
Do you have any
Yes.
introduction, Einar, or something before we get started?
Yeah, that's a good point.
No, there's basically no introduction other than thanking you guys, John and Chris, for offering to do your session about 10 Power FX tricks that, yeah, we had no idea that we need so badly. So thank you very much. We saw this session at Nordic Summit in Oslo a week ago or something, just over a week ago. It was amazing. So with that, I think I'll just hand the reins over to you guys, and you should be able just to share your screen and share the magic.
You want to start, Chris? Maybe we lost him, actually.
Either
I
he's
see he looks very frozen.
extremely still or he's.
I can hear you guys.
Now we can hear you as well.
Yeah, no.
Okay, that's weird because I also see frozen cameras, but I can hear you, so I don't know at this point.
Okay. Ooh.
This just happens. Oh no. Alright. Can you guys see my screen now? Because then we
Yes.
are good to
Yes,
go.
sir.
Yes.
Cool. So generally, just want to like disclaim here from a start-off point that usually we do this session live, and Jon and I haven't really tried doing this session virtually. It's basically not when we're not next to each other, so there might be some dynamics and stuff that kind of disappear in a way. And if we deliver a joke, there might be a delay on it. So I'm not really sure how that's going to work out. Yeah, it's gonna be fun. We also have to try it. Yeah. So basically, the first start of this presentation is gonna be by me, and then halfway in, we're gonna swap screens, and then Jonas gonna take over and run with it. Also, one thing that I think at least is a bit unusual with how we're doing this is that the entire thing is just a Canvas app. So we don't have PowerPoint slides, no nothing. We just have the Canvas app itself. We refer to a Power Automate flow, some SQL, but there's no like presentation really here. It's just technical. And just before we get to this, you can of course have access to the application afterwards. So it's not like we're gonna keep it to ourselves. You don't need to take a ton of notes. Of course you can, but also I can see the session is being recorded. So there's a lot of good things going on here. So yeah, generally, without further ado, let's try and get into it. The session we refer to here is called 10 Power FX Tricks You Didn't Know You Needed, which basically means that we're going to be covering tricks here. And the idea is to cover 10 tricks that you didn't know you needed. So we haven't counted yet, and it differs every single time, but we're going to be doing more than 10 tricks. So I think we're talking somewhere between 30 and 50, depending on how good of a day it is. And how much of a mood we're in. But besides that, hopefully you get 10 learnings from here. My own name is, oh, I went in and did something I shouldn't have done there. Usually I'm not on the cursor. Awesome. My name is Chris. I work at Inspire. I'm a Power Platform architect and been working with the Power Platform for at least the past 5 years full time. So that's pretty fun. I blog at skillsfrills.com. So if you're interested in more Power FX, especially Canvas apps and SQLs, well, then maybe that's where you want to go. And then I am joined by Jon. Do you want to do your own intro?
Sure. I'm Jon, or John, if that's easier. I figure Jon might work for Icelandic guys and girls. Also a consultant with Inspire in Denmark, located in Copenhagen. So we're a few hundred kilometers apart, Chris and I. I work primarily in the intersection between Fabric and the Power Platform. I do a lot of blogging around how to use Canvas apps embedded in Power BI, how to monitor your Fabric tenant with Power Automate, that kind of integrations. So if you're curious about that, check out my blog or my LinkedIn. Feel free to connect there. Occasionally, I also build pure Canvas app stuff, and that's why I'm doing this session with Chris.
Yeah, and we're running these sessions often, as often we can get to do it. So you might also be able to see it out in the world somewhere, hopefully, at some point. Yeah, so basically what we're going to be starting with is the first trick here is referred to as using galleries for repeating components. But just before we get into that, and usually we refer to the audience and ask them to raise their hands and everything, but 3 people have cameras on, so I'm just going to skip that part. Just going to assume that not many people use components in one way or another. So just first off here, the header here itself is a component. And generally on every single page here, we have a few tricks. We're going to navigate back and forth to go between the tricks. But what I don't want to do here is I don't want to create the navigation of every single page. So lucky me, I built a component for it, and inside my components, I can then just add a single back button in here, and there's a fabulous, beautiful button for it, which looks like this. And if I just write my PowerFX in here, which then becomes back, then now this appears on every single repeating component I have. So now I have a back button here, which was not there before. But if I go to page 2, it's also there. And page 3, it's also there. So generally, if we have something that needs to be managed in multiple varieties of the same thing or the exact same thing on multiple different pages, then we can refer to this. And just before we get too deep with it, the name here, so using galleries for repeating components, and it changes here. So every time it adopts the name of the screen out here. So if I change this name, it changes the header here. And that's also managed inside the component where we refer to the application's active screen's name. So it
There's
can
a surprising number of hidden properties in that app property there, app function.
Yeah, it actually gets quite crazy. And now I saw Christoph is also on the call, even though unverified. I guess you're not Icelandic, but he also does a session on power, error handling, and he also refers to this app component quite a bit. So yeah, that thing does a lot. But generally, the idea for this trick is we're covering galleries, and galleries is really cool for repeating things. One thing we often use them for is if we have a list of data that could be in SQL, Dataverse, SharePoint, what have you, and we want to show the same data unspecified amount of time with a variety in it, then we use a gallery. But what we can also use here, in this case, you're using it for buttons. We can also use it for a variety of icons or what have you. So generally, if you want to show a thing a repeating amount of times, no matter if you know the amount or not, a gallery can be your friend because it's gonna improve your performance. It's much better to have one gallery with one button repeating 10 times instead of having 10 buttons because it actually counts them as 2 controls instead of 10 controls. So that's a very neat trick. Also, just to show how it's done here, it's just in the items pane of the gallery. We could refer to this as collection or whatever we wanted. But basically, I have my text, which becomes the text inside the buttons, in this case, trick 2, trick 3, etc. And then I have my navigation, which is then a reference to the actual screens inside my Power App. And then on the buttons itself, we just have the text here. Okay, we're going to start with onSelect. So we have the navigation is navigate to this item dot navigation. So we can just refer to it once. And then the same thing goes for text is this item.text. So I only have one button I want to manage here. And if I want to move it, well, I move it once and all of them jumps with it. So that's the beauty of galleries and that's the beauty of repeating items, even though they aren't necessarily data-based. And now is the time where I would ask, does this make sense to you guys? And everybody nodded, so that's awesome. I love their sessions. The next trick here is going to be covering data generation magic with sequence. And in many ways, it's magic. In many ways, it's not. But we're just going to look at some of the caveats that are in here. So the first thing I have here is the standard date selector built by Microsoft themselves. And one of the things we can notice about this one in particular is that in the years section, it goes very, very far back, actually all the way to 1899. And for user experience, this is pretty bad. It also goes all the way to 2124, so 100 years ahead of us. If I'm working with this, I might not want to do all this scrolling. But there are ways to like fix this, and we can show that in a second. But if we just what I want to focus on here for now is the sequence part of things. And now I have an Alt button that is stuck. There we go. So in this case, it always also generates the ability to put in the hour, so between 00 and all the way up to 23. But the bad thing here is that it's hard coded. So Microsoft actually went away and said, whenever we create a date reference using a form, it's going to write the values hard coded. So if we want to change something at some point, we're going to have to change it manually, which is potentially taking a while. Now between 0 and 24, it's not too bad. If we then add the minutes instead, we go 0 to 60 all of a sudden, or 00 to 59. So this way we can see how we gradually expand on this. So just to like defeat these three things, first off, with the date, what we're going to run is that we have the end year, which can be the year of the date that is today, and then we can add 2. So generally, we should all know that today is the 10th of October. If I take the year of this, I will then see it's 2024, and then if I add 2, I get 2026. And therefore, this one runs no further than 2026. So we don't necessarily have to hard code values in here either. We can have these be dynamic. The important part here is the second the date is then 2025, this one will go for 2025 to 2027. So I don't need to change my apps as we get further on and on. That's pretty neat. But if we want to talk about sequence, and of course we want to, here is basically we mimicked what they did up here, creating the numbers 00 to 23. But the difference here is that we did it with sequence. So sequence is basically, and if you're already in the development world from other aspects, you might know for loops. It's not exactly a for loop, but it's something that repeats a certain action multiple times. So basically it says, how many times do you want to do it? In this case, I want to do it 24. Where do you want to start at? I want to start at 0. And what's our increment? So how many, like, what's the value we increase with every time? In this case, it's 1 because then I can just do my math on the side. And then this is actually able to give me the number 00 to 23 instead of having hard coded them. So that's again pretty neat. In this case, as I said before, we could have just written it manually. That would have been okay. But if we extend it to 60, then it gets a bit more tedious. And then I could give a task to Jon and say, hey, why don't you increase this to 200? And he would say, sure, I can just write it 200. And at the same time, I would change my number here from 60 to 200, and then I would be done. So now this one scales all the way to 200 instead. Actually, it resets at 100. Oh, my bad. Let's do 100 for the next demo. So basically, the idea is hard coding it versus using sequence to do the dirty work for you can be really neat here. And yeah, I'm just assuming there's no questions. This is awesome in a way.
I guess it's the latter part of the function that breaks it after 100 with the right clause that we have.
Indeed, because it cannot take that many characters.
So you could make it work with some additional logic.
I think if you change this to 3, you'd be golden.
Yeah.
It doesn't support 100 right now. Yeah. Then another way to do this is basically we could select the year and then the month and then the day. That's also okay. But one of the purposes here is to say, while we can use sequence to generate data, which is really cool, we can also do some other things, and that is using native functions. So in the case of the year, it's just a simple, again, I want sequence. In this case, I take the year of today and I add the values from sequence. So basically, this gives me 24, 25, and 26. So exactly as we mimicked up here. But if I want to do the months and if I want to do the days, there's no point in me using sequence because there actually exists a formula for this right out of the box. And I found this randomly. I don't think it's well documented. It is out there. So basically calendar dot, and then you have months short, but you also have months long. So if you want January instead of Jan, you can go long rather than short. And the same thing rings true for the weekdays. So if you want Sunday all the way to Saturday, you actually have calendar.weekdays long. You don't need to go in and use your head to figure out how to generate this with sequence. You just use the standard built-in functions. So that's also pretty neat. While sequence is awesome, while building these things out of the box, while building these things ourselves is really cool. Using the out-of-box functionalities will often give us a better performance because then it doesn't need to calculate these things. They're actually straight up in there. So yeah, take that as another tip. Use the native functionality often when you can, and then well, do your own magic when it doesn't support it. And just to extend a bit on this, I would ask how many people have used for all. I'm guessing most people have used for all. Again, I see 4 hands almost in the air. That's cool. Out of 3 cameras, yeah. So generally, often we see for all, which is then put outside. And then inside we have the sequence. So basically, I'm doing something a set amount of time, and that's okay. But generally, be aware because for all can suck your performance out of you. So again, you're getting the app at the end, but you could rewrite this using add columns instead. Sorry, this one. Add columns instead. And this one does the exact same thing. So these two are identical in the results. So they go from 12 a.m. all the way to 11:45 p.m. with 15-minute intervals. And the code is almost the same. But the difference is that add columns performs the hell out of for all because add columns actually does it at once, whereas for all does it 96 separate times. Yeah, so again, we want to avoid for all when we can. For all is not the enemy, but we would like to avoid it whenever we can. And often the same story is true in Power Automate with avoiding apply to each, because Power Automate loves throwing that thing at us when we don't really need it. Get rid of it, run first instead. And just as a finishing note on this with sequencing is you can also use it to generate other things than numbers. And Jon also has a case on this later. But in this case, we're generating the alphabet. So basically, I want 26 letters because English alphabet. That's how it works. And then in this case, we're running the Unicode characters, so that basically represents the letters of the alphabet in here. So running this, we're actually able to generate the letters from A all the way to Z. But what's important to notice here is it's capital letters, which can be a neat thing. But if we insist in the small letters instead, so the non-capitals, we can change the 65 to 97, and now it's the small letters instead. And basically, this is all logic based on Unicodes. So this is not because I know that 65 is capital A. This is because I Google what's the Unicode for capital A, and it tells me it's 65. And then what's the equivalent for non-capital A, and then it tells me that's 97. But it's just to show we can generate a lot of random things and also less random things with sequence. So the use cases are actually quite a lot. I recently put on LinkedIn as well, I built a chess game. And if you want to figure out how to do that, it's also publicly available, and that abuses sequence, to put it mildly. Yeah. So on to step number 3 or trick number 3. And now I'm guessing Jon is starting to look at the time because he also wants to have his part. Yeah, exactly. I just want to know, actually, are we running till 45 or till 00?
0, 0.
Okay, so we have
45,
1
0,
hour.
no stress.
I need to go slower then.
You're good.
Awesome. So again, with many of these tips and tricks that we're going to be talking about and covering, we're also going to be talking about user experiences. Because in the end, if your users don't like using your applications, they're not going to use them. And if people don't use your applications, you don't get to build them. So it's actually quite important with this user experience and thereby the adoption. So the thing we're going to be covering here is navigates and resets. And Jon always has a lovely comment here, so I'm waiting for that to happen at the end of this trick in particular. I hope it comes again. But basically, this application is very simple. It asks for my first name and my last name, and then the country I'm based in. So Chris Hansen, and I'm from Denmark. And then I can scroll down on this canvas. So when I scroll down, I have these buttons down here. And these buttons have a navigate, a cancel, and submit. And what's important is when I press navigate here, obviously it's going to jump away from the screen. And I have my 3.1 temporary navigation, again with the component. And here I also have a back button, so these one could be used interchangeably, doesn't matter. But when I navigate back, what's important to notice is here, I'm still scrolled down. So as a user, this page has not reset for me. And my information is still written here. And this can be both a good thing and a bad thing. If we are bringing users somewhere temporarily for them to do an additional input and then go back and continue with what they're doing, this is a good thing that it stayed like this. But if this was not the case, and then it might have like remained residual values from a previous entry or something, this is a very bad experience because then I actually have to change them all by myself afterwards. So instead, I have this button that does cancel. So cancel just basically refreshes or resets my whole frame. And the way it does that is what we're going to be covering. So navigate was just a simple navigate. If I can get in there, there we go. So navigate is just a simple navigate, but cancel, what it does is that it resets my canvas 1. So canvas 1 is the one that does the scrolling part here. That's the whole thing. And then it also resets all my inputs here. And again, while this gives a different user experience, there's no necessary saying which one of these is better because it's going to depend on your scenario. But both of them are very, very useful, resetting and not resetting. So knowing that you have the ability to is quite important. One thing I also want to cover here is the submit button. Now, I'm not going to submit this anywhere. I don't have anywhere to submit it. So there's no patch, there's no form. But what is important is that inside my submit button, I can actually select another button as well. So in this case, this button, the submit button, selects button 4. So this button itself does nothing, but it does call all the contents of cancel. So if I once again write Chris Hansen and I'm from Denmark, and I submit it, it's going to reset because it does what cancel does. So this way we can avoid repeating logic. Instead of having all the logic inside submit with the submit on top and all the logic inside cancel, I can just have submit call cancel. I hope that makes sense because I think it's awesome. Now, another thing, and this is where it becomes the more hidden part, is that often we have this functionality called unvisible. So basically, when I show a screen, we want to be rendering something. So on top of this, we often create some loading spinners and everything to make sure the user isn't bored while they're waiting for the data to appear, or you might want to clean up some fields and do our housekeeping, so to say. a very overlooked feature here is what's called unhidden. So unhidden can do the exact same thing, except it happens when we go away. And that actually often gives us the experience of the user that they notice it even less because we start our process earlier. So in this case, I would also be able to put select button 4 on my unhidden. And now when I go here, I will write Chris and Hansen and Denmark. And then I navigate. So I didn't change navigate at all. And then I go back. Now it's reset because it's now on my unhidden property. So this way, once more, instead of having my code in my button, I can now actually put it into the unhidden property. So using these functions can reduce the amount of code, and it can reduce the amount of times we repeat certain code. And that's very much the point here. Reduce code, improve code. That's the whole session, really.
Seriously, I've so many times I've put the same code on unvisible on 4 different pages. And I only half a year ago realized when Chris showed me this that that there was an unhidden property. It's like
Yeah.
you forget that there are these standard properties sometimes on screens and on the app itself.
Certainly, also because we're very focused often on where we're going, not necessarily where we came from. So
Yeah.
unvisible is much more logical to use than unhidden. But unhidden in many cases is actually way more powerful because then we could have, say, on my main site here, then unhidden and unvisible can actually do a lot of resets in here. Yeah. So hopefully that's useful. Now for my final trick of the day, we're going to be mastering the strings that match. So basically, you can call me some sort of master of puppets. How many? No, I'm doing it again. How many people are familiar with regular expressions? One, two, three, four. Many people. There's a lot of people. Okay, half the room at least is familiar with regular expressions. That's awesome. So basically, regular expressions is a thing that we have available to us inside Power Apps as well, at least in Canvas. We also have them in model-driven apps if you want to code your way out of it at least. But it's not very present in Power Automate. It's very present in Power Automate Desktop though. But what it can help us with is can help us making sure that the whatever the user's input is actually correct. And again, a throwback to Christoph, who's on the call. He has a session where we handle errors. In this context, we can actually prevent errors from happening. So that's also really nice. So if we just jump right into it, I have a field here that says email. So the idea is that I have to put in emails here. This is a very common thing, but it could also be an address, or it could be a phone number, or it could be whatever unique identifier where you have a certain pattern that you want to be using. It could also be a first name, last name, so they have to have 2 names. You can't just write Pluto or whatever. But in this case, I'm going to write Chris. And now I have 4 separate regular expressions here that is watching it. And the first one says that doesn't spell Chris. While I just wrote Chris, I would kind of have to disagree here because this doesn't indeed say Chris. But what it doesn't say is Chris with a capital C. So the second I write with a capital C instead, it then validates and says, yeah, okay, you're golden. Now it does indeed say Chris. And then this is just to show you very much the basics of what are we actually able to do here. Now we can extend it into emails and talk about emails instead. So I'm gonna reveal my own email here or something, and then write c@l.dk. And then here it says it doesn't spell Chris, which is very true. It does say more than Chris or something different than Chris. But according to the standard functionality, which is the standard regex inside Power Apps for email validation, this is an email. And according to a simpler regex method I made, it's also an email. But the scenario where it's not an email is according to down here. So it's a bit hard to show actually right now. So basically here we also have a more complex setup that validates whether it's an email or not. So what I can write here is if I write Chris and then I can add a slash at live.dk. Now this one will say this is indeed a validated email. So the standard functionality actually approves of this one. And my simple regex also approves of it. But most people here would know that you can't have a slash inside an email. So in this case, I would be able to add a lot of different things and my emails would bounce back. So using the standard functionality and my simpler functionality can get you a far way, but in this case, it would lose. But then we can use the more advanced methods, in this case, a more complex regex, and then it actually is approved. So just before we get into what is actually going on in here, I just want to say ChatGPT, and Jon is usually the one saying this, but ChatGPT is really good at regex. It loves writing regex. So if you have a pattern, you can throw it to ChatGPT and say, write a regular expression for me, and it will help you with that. And also there's a website called regex101.com that is really good at getting you learned in these regex things. And while I browse over here, what do we say about regex?
Yeah, it was just my old teacher who had that saying that if you have a problem and you think you can solve it with regex, you have two problems. I hate regex with a passion, and I completely agree with that. I think ChatGPT helps a lot, but it's not my best friend.
Yeah. So regex can be a bitch. And in this case, what we're running is we're using the function that's called match. And then in this particular case, I'm looking at full match, but you don't need to worry about those details of that for now. But basically it says match, where do I want to look at it, and what am I looking for? And then my match options, again, these two, don't worry about them. So in this case, I'm looking for capital Chris. And if I change this to non-capital Chris, it says that doesn't spell Chris, which is awesome. But if I change this to a small c instead, now it approves of it all of a sudden. So this one is case sensitive, which is awesome in its own sense. Then if we extend it to start looking at emails instead, um, if we extend it to start looking at emails instead, in here again we have the match, where am I matching, and then my match pattern, so to say. And match has these defaults. So inside match, I can by default find emails, etc. Yeah, so emails and a letter and all these sort of things. But what I would suggest is just getting to know regex instead. But just to prove, the email functionality returns a regex that looks like this. So it says dot plus at dot plus yada yada. So this is basically what regex looks like, and it can be a real bitch to work with. In my simpler setup, this is the regex that's written here. So basically it says again the dot, the at, the dot, and then it wants an actual dot, and then it wants pretty much anything after it. So this is again a very naive approach, which can allow for pretty much anything. Now, when we go to the just a bit more complex regex, and this is not necessarily very complex regex, it's just this is where it's getting started, then it gets to look very daunting very quickly. Also, I just want to add this to true, actually, or not. What happened there? All right. So in this case, the regex looks like this. So we can see very quickly it can go very crazy here. What I've
This
done
is
in
just simple regex. Yeah.
this is simple regex. What I've done here is instead of asking it to look for any kind of character, it's now looking for specifically the letters A to Z, both capital and non-capital, but it's also looking for A, U, and O because those are to use those in Iceland too, actually.
Yeah,
Somebody's
some of
nodding.
those.
All right. So basically, if we have letters outside the standard A to Z, then we have to add them manually in here. But it takes pretty much any character. Again, important to notice, I've used the non-capital versions. So if we use a capital A, U, or O here, it would indeed reject me. It also allows the numbers 0 to 9, and then the whole shebang goes on. An important note here is also towards the end, we see that the domain, so dot something, can be at most 4 characters long. And that's because domains generally aren't longer than 4 characters. Just to put it out there. So again, regular expressions, they can be a very, very, very good friend of yours, but they can also be a huge headache, especially when we have to figure out why they work and why they don't work. And with that being said, I think it's time you take over on the screen, Jon.
I'll do my best. So I'm hoping you
Thank you,
guys can
Chris.
see my screen here.
Welcome. Yeah, we see
Oh,
it.
yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So to continue with the fun here, jumping right into to the next set of tricks here, and this is a couple of tricks that has to do with optimizing your code, both for performance but also for code duplication purposes. The first one that I'm going to show is using the formula with. And Chris always makes fun of me because in a second I'm going to be talking about with and width. So bear with me when this gets a little confusing. Just to tell you how does width work. On the left-hand side of the screen, I just have two sliders here which control the size of a square. Then I have a text label that multiplies the two values to get the area. And I have another text label that shows both the width, the height, and the area. This is not necessarily a complex operation or anything. It's just to introduce you to the formula with what does it do. So the square, nothing fancy happening. The width is just set to the slider value, right? So the way that we get the area here is I use width as a sort of CTE. For those of you who are SQL native, It's like an in property variable that's only available in the context of this exact property. So I could define the variables width and height within these curly brackets inside of a width formula. And when I then escape the curly brackets, I can reference these variables any number of times without having to recalculate the value. So that is a performance enhancing capability of width. It gets a little more complex due to the fact that we can nest multiple width statements. So if I first store the width and the height in two different variables, and I nest another width formula inside of that, I can create a new variable called area that uses the variables from the outside width. And then when I escape my final width statement, I can use a combination of the width variables from any of the nested widths in the same formula. So this is just returning string. Nothing fancy going on here. You wouldn't need to do these things on the left-hand side. In this case, I think that's a little overboard. But on the right-hand side here, I have stuff where it gets a little more interesting. So over here, I'm saying, okay, I want to use the Office 365 connectors to return all of the colleagues that have the same manager as myself. So if I go ahead and I search for Jon here, I can see the entire team of mine here. If I search for Chris, I would hopefully be able to do the same and see the entirety of Chris's team over here. And the way that the code here works is that it uses a lot of sort of nested lookups. And let me just try to show here. So the first one that I'm using here is I'm creating inside of a with statement a simple virtual table, you could say, and stores it in the local memory, in which I filter the Office 365 connectors and just get the output of that. A little tip that I often show, and which Chris likes me to showcase, is that you can always get a preview of data by highlighting a value, an array, or a table. You can see the items that are currently being filtered here. That's pretty neat for development purposes. This gets a little more complex when I want to display the second gallery here, the team of the selected employee. So let me just grab the actual control here. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, right? I have triple nested with statements here. What am I doing? I'm saying, okay, first I want to figure out who is the manager of the selected user. So I say there's a little bit of error handling here because the Office 365 connectors likes to throw errors when nothing is selected. But basically, I'm just saying, okay, I want to look up the manager of the user that's being selected in the first gallery. Then I want to use that selected user's manager.email, because this is in fact storing a full record and not only one column. So I have all these different properties. I can reference selected users manager.mail to get a virtual table that is the direct reports of the manager of the selected user. Then I can use that vtable multiple times to extend it with additional columns in a third with statement. So I can here say add columns, and I can add to vtable. I can get the manager name by again referencing the selected users manager variable that I set up here, and now grabbing the display name as well as the email and adding those as columns to my vtable here. And the reason why this is a good idea to do with statements, now this is a little bit of an extreme scenario, is that, well, if I hadn't done this, if I had not put selected users manager up here, I would have had to copy this piece of code and put it here and here and here. And essentially you'd have the same line of code 4 times on this gallery, which is not great for performance.
And on top
And also, yeah, sorry,
do
go ahead.
the API 4 times. So you'd actually be making the same call to the API 4 times, potentially throttling the API, throttling yourself. And if you scale this up, it just gets worse. If you imagine having this inside for all, then like quadrupling the calls is a bad choice.
And of course, just for sort of a code maintenance perspective, if you wanted to change the value of this and all of a sudden reference a different data source, you'd only have to replace this value once instead of having to do it in 4 different places. So there are so many good reasons for getting familiar with width. And although this is a bit of an extreme example, there's definitely a lot that you can do with that. I hope the example stood clear enough. Let's jump to the next trick in interest of time. Oh, I haven't gone back here. I'll just do this. All right. Another favorite little formula of mine that goes a little underused is coalesce, which is not unique to PowerFX, but is good to know, right? So coalesce is a formula that returns the first non-blank blank argument that it's given. So right now I have two text boxes. The left one has the code if is blank and then a variable that contains a record with me. Then if it's blank, display variable is blank, otherwise display my email. The right one says, okay, coalesce a similar variable with Chris's personal record and his email, and if that's blank, return variable is blank. So they do the same thing, and when I initialize the variable, they will show our emails. If I reset them, they will show blank. But this code is, well, already a little simpler than this if statement. But the real kicker and where coalesce really comes to its right is when you use this inside of patch formulas. So on the right-hand side here, I am doing the same operation again with two different buttons that do the same thing. If I want to create a booking with a booking description, booking Iceland, and Iceland 1 as description, if I press the left-hand button here, it patches a new record to my list here. I can see it. And the code that did this is a very standard piece of PowerFX code that I imagine many of you might have written before if you work with patch. So I say, okay, if there is not already a record with this booking name in my destination, then look up the record and overwrite it. And if there is none, then default create a new record in this database verse table. So in cases like this, where I want to create or overwrite an existing booking, say I wanted to change this to Iceland 2, then that code does the trick, but it's a little inefficient. I can write this same piece of code with much less text, much less code. Here's the better example that uses coalesce. Again, I'm patching a data source. And then instead of doing if is blank, look up and look up again and defaults, I can just use coalesce and say look up. And if that's blank, it doesn't return any value, then coalesce will automatically continue down and give you the alternative here, defaults, creating a new option. So this code does the exact same thing as this long example that I've commented out here. And this just escalates when you have more complex patch statements and more complex lookups. This is a feature that's really valuable. I saw that Chris White, another MVP in the Power Platform community that some of you might have heard of, he runs the blog Platforms of Power, I believe it's called. He had an article 2 weeks ago on Coalesce that it's a little more extensive than this and gives you a lot more practical examples as well. So you can check out his blog for a few extra examples. Just a small tip. But I love doing this in my patch statements. We're not done talking about patch. Another really neat feature that I realized working on a project a couple of years ago is that sometimes when we create records, we need to create parent and child records at the same time. And that's a little complex. So say I wanted to create Icelandic booking V2 here with a random description. And I want to create a reminder as well, because we're going to do this session again tomorrow, maybe, I don't know. If I want to create both of these records in two different destination tables and retain a relationship between the two, I need to match the identifiers between these two, right? So I can accomplish this with a simple piece of code here in which I have two patch statements. I'm going to patch to my bookings table the name and description of the booking. And then to my reminders table, I'm going to patch the reminder name, the reminder date. And then to get the ID of the booking, I can use the last function to get the last booking name out of, or rather the last ID, because this name column is the ID column, never mind that, but I can get the last ID that was created up here. And because they run sequentially, this would return me as well the ID of that booking, and that would be a relationship. The problem is, what if you're multiple users at once who create bookings at the same time, or there's other network errors? Using the last function is not a great solution. What we can do instead is that we can store the output of a patch function in a variable using set. So when I patch PowerFX tricks bookings, if I use a set function around this, it will store the entire thing in a local variable that I can reference. And I can just use var last booking.name. And now this is just locally, right? This is not depending on any network connection or you being the last person accessing the app. And we can create a foolproof relationship between our two data sources like that. And it gets better than that because we can do this also when we are creating bulk record creation with collections. So if I were to say booking one, desk one, and this is a reminder I want to do sometime in the future. Oh, the way I set this is up is say, okay, I want a reminder 2 days before the event date that I set here. Something like that. I can patch multiple here. It works the exact same way, more or less, except we are looping through a gallery of items for each of these items. And here I'm being a little naughty and using for all. I have a solution for that later. But I'm patching here the bookings table for all the items that were in my gallery. And then every time I do that, I collect a new row into call temp bookings. So now when I look in call temp bookings here, this got a little too small. Let me just minimize this slightly. You can see that there is now, there should actually be 2 rows of data if I can make this small enough. I keep hitting that. I'm using my trackpad right now, excuse me. So you can see there are 2 items here. And that's because I looped through my gallery, I patched 2 items into the destination and collected them into a collection. Then afterwards, I can loop through that collection I created and do the same thing and patch my reminders using the temp bookings.name and temp bookings.booking date because I'm using the as disambiguator to give this collection a different name. Neat little extra tip for you there. I really like doing that whenever I loop through things. But I can do that to reference the unique IDs for all the items we created up here. So this technique using set and using collect to store the output of your patch formulas in local memory is really useful for those parent-child hierarchies. And there are just many, many use cases where you end up doing that. I think every time you want to give the user the ability to create new options and drop downs and stuff like that, you often end up with these parent-child hierarchies that you need to maintain. Okay, so another neat feature, and we're slowly approaching the end here. What if you've initialized a collection or a variable and you wish to change the values of these localized variables and collections? Well, we can also do that. So actually, let me jump out of play here. If I initialize a variable here and say var Chris and var Jon here just contains, again, a lookup user record of Chris and I. The problem is, for some reason, the office location of neither of us is recorded in Office 365. What if I wanted to add this piece of information to these local variables? Well, we could say that today we're in Reykjavik, or I don't know where in Iceland each of you are located. If I click my magic button here and now check my variables, it will say that our office location is Reykjavik. And the way that worked is that we can simply say, well, okay, patch this variable, set the office location equal to what was in our text box, and then set our variable to the output of that patch. I had somebody at Nordic Summit who claimed that I didn't need this part. I haven't tested since, but when I initially made this demo, I did indeed need to wrap my patch statement in set to update this. Your mileage me wary. You can do the same though with collections. So here, let me just initialize a collection. And this is where I use the trick that Chris showed earlier. I'm just initializing a collection of the alphabet from, oh, did that not work? Oh yeah, there we go. Maybe not. Create collection. Let's see. There we go. So I got a collection of values from A to C using that sequence trick that Chris showed you earlier. And I added a blank column saying column to be patched. What if I wanted to modify the C and E values only in that collection? Well, we can do that using patch and just say, well, look up where the value equals C and hard code in the values that we want to change, right? So alter C and E. And now we'll get the result that C and E now has, this is the letter C, this is the letter E as expected. We can, of course, do this dynamic too. Say, I want to modify A, and the letter A will be modified if you do this dynamically. So we can say the value should dynamically reference, of course, the text input, and we can concatenate even the contents to give us something useful. This is letter A. Now things get a little funny if we want to do something with all of the blank values that are in our collection. So one might think, well, okay, couldn't we just say patch col alphabet and then look up all the records where column to be patched is blank and say alter those? I say here that it's an error. It's not truly an error, but if we do this, what happens is that it will only modify the first blank record. And that's because lookup only returns one record. So if we want to alter multiple records in our collection, we need to use something like update if to say, okay, in the entire col alphabet collection, if column to be patched is blank, then update the collection to, I don't know what this is. Let's alter that. Let's just click it. And we'll see that now this modified all of the different letters. A bonus little trick that I just thought I'd throw in here, not because it's related to this much. Of course, we can add columns to this, and there's a formula that not a lot of people know exists that's called GUID. So if you want to create a unique ID for your collection, you can use this GUID formula to get a 28-character unique ID, same as you would if you create new records in Dataverse. There's a unique ID in that. Very useful if you for some reason are not creating it server side in your SQL database or in Dataverse. Or if you're just working with local collections and you need a unique identifier that's, well, statistically speaking, at least unique. Okay, a few minutes left. Time for the star of the show, I'd say. So the true game changer in terms of optimizing your patch performance lies in getting rid of that for all loop that we talked about earlier. So just for demo purposes, I think at Nordic Summit, we created too many records here. Let's just start with 50 here. So I'm just creating a collection here of 50 records. See, there's nothing fancy going on here. I feel like a magician every time I click these buttons. I have created a collection here where I just randomly append, or add rather, 20 columns worth of random strings. So we get this crazy collection that just has, a lot of data to be patched. 50 rows, 20 columns, quite a lot of data, I'd say, right? If we want to patch that data to a destination, this is the way most people would do it, I find. They use some kind of combination of patch, PowerFX bookings, with all of these informations here, and they loop through a collection to do that with for all. And we can just, let me just actually open up the monitor here, see if this starts, so we can record how long that takes, right? I think that works. So if I go ahead now and I have 50 records here, and if I say patch individually with for all, you can see this grayed out, and it's the ants are running across the screen, right? This is taking a few seconds. Not sure how many it takes for 50, but I think we were almost up to a minute at Nordic Summit with a few hundred. But you can see now this succeeded, right? Not a great user experience to have to wait that long for creating your records. But there is two different tricks we can take advantage of to eliminate this problem. The first is we can schema match a collection of data to our destination. I do that here by saying, okay, I'm creating a new collection here. Then I'm taking the collection I used over here and I rename all the columns to the exact name that they have in Dataverse using the weird schema prefix and everything and lowercase letters and all of that. If you don't do this, this will throw you an error. So I rename all of the columns to the exact Dataverse destination column names. Then I also get rid of the additional value column because that's not present in my Dataverse table. I cannot have any discrepancies here. And then what I can do is I can patch my destination using a source table that has the exact same format. And this is all the code I need. And this does upsert to that destination. So it creates new records or it updates existing records. It does not delete missing records. It's an upsert. This is all the code you need. And this is way more performant. So let's try and click this and see how fast it goes. That's it. It's done. You almost blink and you missed it, right? But it worked. We can go to this one here, and you'll see that the timestamp is updated. You see here it ran 1351. Down here it started with the 1352, and it was done in a second, half a second, no problem. 50 records like that. If we went up to like 500 records, this would start taking time as well, because there is just, it's a linear curve basically. It's not able to just magically create all these records in an instant. That there is a linear progression to this. But if you have a case where you need to bulk create, like create 1,000 records or create 500 and update 500 in the same breath, there is an even more performant option than this, and that is using stored procedures. So we cannot do that in Dataverse, of course. These first two options that I mentioned, they are available with Dataverse, they are available with SQL. If we are using a SQL database, we have another step we can take. Azure SQL works, any place with stored procedures, so Fabric as well, Fabric data warehouses, and you can simply take your column, format it as JSON, remembering to do JSON format indent 4 for this to work, and then run a stored procedure that unpacks this and throws this into your database. Just for fun, let's do 500 records, click stored procedure in SQL, and it ran. That took, okay, well, I guess it didn't run. Sometimes our Power Automate flow is not very happy. I'm not sure why that failed today. But this,
I know, actually.
did you disable the database?
No, I disabled the flow, I believe.
Okay,
But you
too
just
bad.
if you like do the waters for a minute, I'll fix it.
So what you need to know here is that the scenario here, I'm using a Power Automate flow inside of my Power app to simply throw this into the SQL stored procedure. If this loads, I can show you how that's done. But yeah, so here it is. There is one input parameter here. That's the long JSON string. And then I execute a stored procedure, providing this as the parameter that the stored procedure expects. So of course, you need to know some SQL for this to work. You need to be able to set up a stored procedure. But even I, with limited SQL skills, was able to do this with ChatGPT by my side. So you can do it too, is what I'm trying to say. You can also now, since August, I believe, call stored procedures directly from
Yeah.
Power Apps. So
Also,
that
it
became
works now, so you should be able to run it again.
okay. Let's try. Yeah, it ran, and even faster than it figured out there was an error. It now actually managed to trigger the procedure and insert the rows. I haven't opened the database here, so you can't fact check me, but just trust me when I say that we just created 500 records at the same speed that we created 50 just a minute ago. The thing I wanted to say about the stored procedure thing is just that if you want to today, you don't need the Power Automate thing here. You can just, when you add a new SQL Server data source, I don't have an example here, but if you add a new SQL Server data source and you connect, oh, I do have an example. I need the server name, database name. Anyway, when you log through here, you'll see a tab where it says tables and stored procedures, and you can just select stored procedures, and it's available for you to use. So you don't need Power Automate, and this is generally available.
Yeah, yeah, that was a long one. Just to like finish this one up, because this one is really one that can be cool, I believe. Um, I have a blog post that covers this. It also covers another trick where you can actually keep using for all, but instead of putting for all outside patch, you put for all inside patch, and then you're actually matching the performance of patching an entire collection, almost at least. So if you want to do the comparison between these three things, including stored procedures, then there's an example of that online as well. And I posted the screenshots from what Jon just showed. So the rows are indeed there, showed the performance and everything.
The last thing I wanted to just mention as well, now we're talking stored procedures, a neat little trick that I discovered, I just didn't realize you could do that, is that you can also return the result set of stored procedures inside of Power Apps. So if you have the need to do some complex filtering on a data source that takes a long time to run in PowerFX, maybe you have a gallery where you need a complex filtering condition to display those in your app, you can run a stored procedure database side and push the performance to the database and return the result in Power Apps for much better performance. You can even overcome the 2000 row limit Power Apps data connectors using this trick if you, for some reason, want to display more than 2,000 records to the user at once. But I might come challenge you if you actually have that desire.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that
Yeah.
was it. That was all the tricks.
Excellent. Yeah. That's a really, really helpful one. And loads of tricks in there. And to me, if you are, doing a multiple selections like with the manager and the teams, use the with function. So
I love the with function. It's so good. Anytime you
yeah,
do the same piece of code multiple times in a formula, you should
yeah,
stop and think, wait, I can replace this with and improve your performance.
yeah, exactly. All right, excellent. Thank you very much, John and Chris. Huge pleasure and honor to have you here doing this presentation. I will clean up the recording a little bit and put it on YouTube and post the link here. Someone were asking. And then where can we access that? Do you have it somewhere online or will you send it to me? Or
Let me send that to you. I think maybe it's on my GitHub as well, but I'm not sure. Let me just verify and I'll send it to you,
yeah,
Einar, and you can share it either here in Teams or on the YouTube channel. You feel to do so as well in the description
okay,
or something like that. Yeah.
yeah, excellent. Okay, cool. Super helpful, and we will be back here in 2 weeks' time with Christoph from Poland doing some more app magic.
All right, awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right,
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the week. Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
until next time.
Just in case, in 2 weeks we will be also talking about performance. So there
Yeah,
will be
okay.
also some tricks that are covered today, maybe in a little bit different fashion.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you guys. It was awesome.
All right.
See you
Have
around.
a great day, everyone. Bye.
Looking forward to it. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice day.
Yep.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.